Remember when music wasn't just background noise but a full-on lifeline? When you'd scour liner notes, swap cassettes, and debate with your friends over which band could thrash harder or scream louder? In the gritty 80s underground, far from MTV glossed-up glam metal and synth-pop chart toppers, bands like Agnostic Front were waging a different kind of battle. Their music wasn't polished for mass appeal, it was street-level, raw, and unrelenting. This was hardcore punk in its purest form, an anthem for those living on society's edge. For kids growing up in the shadows of crumbling New York City neighborhoods where every day felt like a survival test, Agnostic Front wasn't just a band. They were a mirror reflecting their reality. With buzzsaw guitars and breakneck rhythms, they captured the rage, disillusionment, and defiance of a generation that was tired of being ignored. But they didn't stop there. As the decade wore on, the band adapted and expanded their sound, embracing the heavier, metallic edge of the rising crossover movement. Hardcore purists might have balked, but for many fans, this evolution only deepened their connection to the band. From the brutal fury of Victim in Pain to the genre-bending Cause for Alarm, Agnostic Front's music told the story of a scene and a band constantly fighting to stay alive. Their journey through the 80s is a time capsule of rebellion, resilience, and reinvention. Let's turn the clock back and explore how these New York hardcore trailblazers carved their legacy into the concrete streets of punk and metal history. Agnostic Front took the sound of the streets to the masses: abandoned tenements, drug raids and overdoses, the homeless on the Bowery, social change without social media, decadence, and general full-scale mayhem. Early Agnostic Front records really capture the vibe of New York and all its boroughs in the 80s. It's like Vinny says in the Flipside interview, Agnostic Front are from the ghetto. Those guys came from poor families and hard lives. It shows in the music, not only because they were expressing their reality, but also in the more literal way. These guys didn't have money for good equipment, practice time at nice studios, or music lessons. A lot of people from the early NYHC scene came from more artistic backgrounds. They weren't rich, but they came from arts communities, parents who played music. There was nothing artistic about Agnostic Front in that sense, but of course that allowed for a really raw and pure expression of their lives. Agnostic Front didn't want to be artistic. They didn't even want to be musicians. They were angry street kids who wanted to mosh. That's the one thing that truly set Agnostic Front apart from their contemporaries. Vinny Stigma picked his band members exclusively on their capabilities as moshers, with absolutely no regard for their musicianship. Vinny was a visionary who could see that moshing, the interaction between band and audience, was the biggest difference between hardcore and punk. There were already bands playing hardcore music. There were already mosh parts, but Vinny was the first to pay attention to the moshers themselves. He realized they were as important to the scene as the bands, and they understood the music better than some of the musicians. They recorded the final version of United Blood on June 1983, and the EP came out in November 1983. When the band released United Blood, they started using the term hardcore because they wanted to separate AF from the druggy and artsy punk scene. Content, lyrics, and message-wise, why do you think this record is exponentially important? The United Blood EP has to be the most powerful music ever recorded by people who couldn't play their instruments. At that point in time, all punk and hardcore bands said they couldn't play because it was still the era of arena rock, when the standard of playing music was Led Zeppelin or the Eagles. In comparison, of course, hardcore bands couldn't play. But looking back at it now, a lot of early hardcore bands like the Adolescents, the Bad Brains, or Die Cruisin', for instance, were phenomenal musicians. Compared to those bands, Agnostic Front could actually not play. But somehow they were able to create an incredibly powerful, menacing, insane sound. They were inspired by DC bands like Iron Cross and SOA, who also couldn't play. But those bands seemed to know what their limits were. Agnostic Front did not. They played like they were in a fist fight with their own limitations. Rabies couldn't keep a beat to save his life, but instead of sticking to simple beats, he tried to overcome himself by playing really chaotic, busy drum beats with a bunch of crazy drum fills all over them. Agnostic Front didn't want to admit they couldn't play, not to themselves and not to you. Other early New York hardcore bands who couldn't play were goofy kids who sang funny lyrics about how they couldn't play. Agnostic Front were skinheads who sang about how they were going to beat you up. Their message was simple. People had been fucking with them their entire lives, and they weren't going to take it anymore. The intense atmosphere around this record changed NYHC forever. It showed people that you didn't need to make fun of yourself for not being good at something that you cared about. It showed that you could make a statement even if you had nothing. United Blood and Victim in Pain are easily their best records. People who make fun of a guitarist like Vinny Stigma, are the kind of people who will never write a good song in their entire lives. These are the people who spend all their time worrying about technique, guitar tone, pedals, and gear. They can flawlessly imitate every guitarist they worship, but no one will ever know their name. None of that bullshit matters if you can't write a good song. Vinny Stigma didn't need anything to create the sound that changed music forever. It was just him and his visionary mind, sitting at his mother's kitchen table in Little Italy in 1977 writing Power. The people that make fun of bad guitar playing will never understand the absolute genius of a song like Power. The Psychos could never keep a lineup together. Every time they gained some momentum, someone would quit the band and they would have to start over again with a new member. The core member of the band, Billy Psycho, was an actual psycho, and I imagine it wasn't easy being in a band with him. They were like NYHC boot camp. You started out playing in the Psychos, and then you would start your own band.